we all, I think, are led into the belief that sure that the world's population is growing, perhaps exponentially still. That's what I would have said at that time, based on what I was learning. And I had no idea that the actual dynamics of everything from how work is going to be like, to how society is going to be like, to how pension systems are going to be like, is fundamentally flawed. And at that moment, I realized something's wrong because, you know what? The same trend was showing up for Germany and Italy and Japan.
South Korea.
Yeah, well, South Korea was just a little bit later, which was interesting. But something triggered in the early 1970s in Japan, Germany, Italy, and you can add Spain, Portugal, Switzerland, Austria, to cause a series of parallel trends. And yet, what I was reading from experts was that these are localized problems. That Japan, it's work-life balance. That in Germany, it's something called Rebenmutter, which is the idea that in parts of Germany, even today, for a woman to have a child and go straight back to work is really something that culturally shouldn't be done. So that might cause some people to delay parenthood. In Spain and Italy, it was down to high unemployment among the youth. Other areas, it was gender balance, etc. So all these localized reasons were being proposed. For me, as a data scientist, you could see clearly, and if I can give you an analogy, it's one of your own. You were talking to Lex Friedman. You talked about the dragon, I think, in terms of the environment context. If someone finds a dragon and they scream, there's a dragon. And I love the analogy, and I since saw that you use dragons quite a lot, so I thought I might too. And it's like you found this little dragon in Japan and the same kind of dragon in Germany and Italy at the same moment in time. And they're starting to get bigger, and I saw...
So they're lizards to begin with.
Right. I mean, they're tiny. They're the size of a kitten, I think, is an analogy I saw. Right. And they're getting bigger, and then suddenly they're appearing in other neighboring countries, and it's growing from there. So the idea that these are localized issues, to me, just did not make sense.
So why do you think you were struck to begin with by the fact that birth rates were plateauing or declining? I mean, because the typical response to that would be either, so what, there's too many people on the planet anyways, or actually it's a net good. So now you said you're in a private company. Now, I should let everybody watching and listening know that one of the markers for the trustworthiness of a data analytic company is that people will actually pay for their information. And so, it doesn't necessarily mean that a private data analytic company is credible, but it does mean at least that they've been able to demonstrate their credibility enough so that they have paying customers, and that's not an easy thing to manage. And so you were doing short-term forecasting that was integrated into the capitalist economy, let's say,
yes,
to help people plan their product development and so forth. Yes. But you came across this data at a much broader level indicating a plateauing birth rate or population growth. Why did that disturb you? Why did you think that was a problem?
Because birth rates less than replacement level spiral downwards. They never stop. If you have fewer children that are required to replace the parents' generation, once that generation grows up, they will, unless birth rates change, which they don't historically, they stay low once they're low, you're going to have fewer people again.
So you see it as a positive feedback loop.
It is. And when you then look up, well, what do you want to find examples of societies coming from low birth rates going back to replacement level, and you realize there are no examples. In fact, there's no historical examples anywhere. And some people
do we have enough of a historical track to consider that a concern?
In modern times, if you look at the number of countries who've fallen to birth rates of 1.7, 1.6, 1.5, when you have no single example of a country going back to replacement level, we should be concerned. In fact, we should be very concerned.
Right. I know places like Quebec, for example, in Canada, with very, very low birth rate, have tried to institute government policies that, for example, make daycare in principle more accessible to young women and in young families, although that's had pretty much zero impact on the outcome. I know that Hungary has put forward a series of policy transformations on the family support front, and my belief is, from what I've read, is that they've at least stopped the birth rate decrease and increased it slightly. So that's the only, I mean, Quebec, it didn't work at all. Hungary, it looks like there's some minor, they're still way below replacement, so it hasn't rectified the problem in any sense.
What's fascinating about Hungary was what I wanted to do was look at something much deeper than the typical birth rate numbers that we see today. I'm trying to change that. If you look deeper, you can find data that if you merge together, which I don't believe anyone had ever done before, that gives you two measures. One is of societal childlessness, and the other is family structure. So the traditional way to measure childlessness is to wait till women are 45 usually, and have some surveys, maybe a census. So you're waiting to the end of the fertility window and counting them then. What I wanted to see was, what is societal childlessness today? If there's a reduction in the number of women starting to have families compared to what you would expect, we should be able to track that now. So looking at Hungary, which I've just been doing recently, was fascinating. I mean, they're giving huge incentives for people to have 3 and 4 children. But the family structure in Hungary is not changing at all. At all. What is changing, which may or may not be linked, it's associative in some way, but causal we don't know, is the childlessness rate in Hungary does seem to be going down. More people look like they're starting to have families. And what happens then is when people start to have families, they go on, because family structure is locked in globally. That's another finding. You know,
And so what do you mean? So we'll go in two directions. What do you mean? What are you speaking about when you're expressing your concerns about family structure?
well, family structure basically is the percentage of women. We say women because we've got so much data on women, but really we should think of men and women. The proportion of women, couples, who have one child, or two, or three, or four, or five, or more. And if you take data for Japan, and you look at 1973, right before the fall in birth rates, the percentages of women having 1, 2, 3, 4 are identical today as they were then. 6% of women in 1973 were having 4 or more children. Today, it's the exact same number, 6%. So our focus has been completely, we've been in a fog looking at overall birth rates. What you find is in Japan in 1974, interesting year, an explosion in childlessness, which went from 3% to 6% to 15 to 21 to 30+% in the space of about 4 years. The same in Italy, the same in Germany.
In 4 years.
In 4 years. It's a shock. It was what I call a baby shock. And then if you look at Korea, South Korea, which you mentioned earlier, if we take South Korea, mid-90s, right in the midst of a currency shock, you see childless rates were already maybe 15% there. Suddenly it goes up to, I believe, 30%, and now it's over 40%.
And this is childless at what age?
Well, when I estimate childlessness, I'm taking for the given population of women, the number of births you'd expect to have at any age, and saying, how many first-time mothers were there? And when you count up the number of first-time mothers of any age group and look at the overall population structure, you can see, well, wait a minute, there's a gap opening up here compared to the number you would expect. So this is like age agnostic in a sense.
Okay.
And as a measure, people say, well, some of those women might, there might be a boom in the future. People might be just delaying, but that doesn't happen. There's no example of those booms ever happening. So it seems to be we've got this cycle going on that people are pulled quite quickly into this, what I call world of unplanned childlessness, if I can. I've had to coin quite a few phrases here and I should explain what I mean by unplanned childlessness. If you look at surveys, look at research, the vast majority of people want children. It's innate. And some don't. That's clear.
What percentage do, approximately?
I'm estimating around 5% don't. There have been Gallup polls in the US done.
Is that different between men and women?
I don't have that data.
Okay. So 5% you figure are out of the game.
Yes.
By voluntary choice.
Yes.
Right. And what percentage are childless?
Well, right now we're looking at 30 to 40% in most developed nations. So the vast majority, 80%, it's estimated in studies. And I think this...
So that's that involuntary childlessness. Yeah, I've been thinking about that lately. We have this notion for men of involuntary celibacy, incels. We don't have a term that's as at hand for involuntary childlessness among women. And it hasn't been recognized as what would you call it, a universal social problem. But you just said 5% of women don't want children, but 30% don't have them. And so there's a huge gap there between desire and reality.
I think, frankly, I believe it's the biggest societal problem that we have, and it's hiding because we haven't recognized it. And if you find people, as I did making the documentary, people who are struggling, 30s, late 30s, women particularly, but men too, who've given up in their 40s. And they're opening their heart to you with a level of what they call grief.
Yeah.
And in the English language, grief is used for one particular context. It's not necessarily used normally for something you never had.
Yeah.
I think in other languages, there are terms that encompass that, but it's the same emotion. And I've been pulled into conversations where I have frankly been brought myself to the depths of understanding the suffering from these people who thought they were going through life, getting the education, probably, starting the career path, probably, thinking that, well, you know what, I'm not 30 yet. I've got time to meet a partner.
Yeah.
And then getting to the point of often there is no partner. Or that biology gets in the way. Yeah,
well, it turns out that life is shorter than people think. You know, I've had clinical clients who followed that path, and some of them were women who had initially decided that they didn't want to have children and then changed their minds quite dramatically in their late 20s, which is a very common pattern, and then couldn't have children. And it was just absolutely disastrous for them. They were often on the artificial fertility route for 10 years with multiple miscarriages and failures on that front. And it's a bloody dismal outcome.
Did you want to have children?
Sim. Gostaria de ter tido filho há 5 anos atrás. Gostaria. Mas não aconteceu. Mas gostaria sim. Gostaria de ter tido antes. De poder ter tido filho antes.
20代の頃にもっとデートをしてもっといい人を見つけてもっと子供を作るように努力すればよかったと思ってます。
I think if you caught me at the right day in my 20s when I was very in love or excited about a partner, I would say yes. But if you were to pry into that, I might say, oh no, that seems crazy to have a kid in my 20s.
Llegó un momento en mi vida que a lo mejor sí quise de verdad intentarlo nuevamente, pero era muy tarde, too late.
Okay, so you're making a case here, you're making a psychological case in some sense at the moment in that this is a phenomenon worth attending to because the vast majority of people who end up childless, which is a more serious immediate problem for women because of the biological restrictions on their reproductive capacity. The reason that's a problem is because so many women end up in that situation despite wanting children. So that's a real psychological problem. But you could take a sociological stance and say, well, as has been insisted upon for 60 years, there's too many people on the planet, and it's just not a bad thing at all if we stop reproducing in this manner. And if the price we have to pay for reduction in the number of excess mouths to feed is that there are some unhappy women, so be it. What do you think about this at a sociological or political or economic level?
As a spouse, a parent, or a leader, people count on you. But if you're constantly tired, unfocused, and just not feeling like yourself, how can you show up the way they need you to? That's where Merrick Health comes in. Merrick is a premier health optimization platform that uses comprehensive lab work, not guesswork, to uncover what's really going on in your body. Hormones, thyroid inflammation, nutrient levels, the markers that matter. Their expert clinical teams build a personalized, research-backed plan just for you, whether it's lifestyle changes, supplements, or prescription treatments. When you know what's going on inside, you can lead with clarity, show up with energy, and stay sharp for your family, your team, and yourself. Head over to merrickhealth.com and use code Peterson for 10% off to join their guided optimization program with your personal medical team. That's merrickhealth.com, code Peterson. Stop guessing, start leading, and start with Merrick Health.
Well, first of all, I think that's a terribly sad thing to contemplate, that we have to somehow enforce perhaps lifelong grief and sadness on a subset of society who were mostly unlucky enough not to have the children they wanted to have for the sake of the planet, when there are other
hypothetical sake, hypothetical
right,
planet, at some future time.
At some future time. Mm-hmm. And to me, the first thing, my reaction, strong reaction, isn't there another way, if that's right? And then you look at data, as a report in Nature last year, on the overall footprint by age group. Quite a number of scientists put their name to it, and it states very clearly that 8% of our footprint occurs when we're aged under 30. Then it rises quite significantly between 30 and around 65, I believe, and then it falls off sharply. Well, that means that if the world's births were to magically, well, it wouldn't be magic, drop by, say, half. I love taking extreme situations. So let's imagine that from tomorrow, only half of the births happen for some crazy reason. That 8% of total emissions or footprint would go down to 4% in 30 years' time. Mm-hmm. This is going to have almost no impact for decades, at a time when I think we have to find other solutions as much as they're needed to solve problems that are out there. So the idea that we're going to inflict this pain, deep personal suffering, pain in people, and perhaps be pleased about it, as I know some people are, I think it's terribly sad. I think it might be that, to come back, I would like to clarify that for those people who don't have the desire, I consider myself a pan-natalist. If you don't want to have children, I will be your biggest supporter to say that's fine. And I think there might be a misunderstanding in society for some people who perhaps don't share that desire, who perhaps can't quite understand how fundamental this desire is.
Yeah, well, most people who are in that boat are being willfully blind, in my experience. And so the idea that there are reasons to not want to have children, one reason is an overwhelming self-centered narcissism. That's not the only reason, but it's definitely one reason. And people talk about, the interference with their personal freedom and their desire to pursue their career. And in that, I read something like the absolute inability to ever sacrifice your own narrow self-interest, and I do mean narrow, to the what would you say, concerns and needs of other people. And so, it's interesting to me that it's 5% that don't want children, and that the rate of that kind of self-centered narcissism is about 4 to 5% too. Now, I am not saying that everyone who decides not to have children falls into that category, but I am saying that a fair number of people who don't want children fall into that category. I mean, if you think about it biologically, every single one of your maternal ancestors for 3.5 billion years reproduced successfully. And it might be that you're the exception to that rule, but if you are, you should think long and hard about why. You also might want to think long and hard about why, given that it's likely to have a pretty damn detrimental effect on your life. It's all fine to be fancy, free, and footloose when you're 30 and 35, but it's a lot less amusing when you're 50, and it might be downright dreadful by the time you're, let's say, 65. So, all right. So on the population front now, we talked a little bit about the psychological catastrophe of involuntary childlessness. I'm curious too about the social and economic consequences. So as you get a demographic bulge, more and more older people and fewer younger people, obviously you have fewer people to take care of the older people. But I also have never really read anything pertaining to models of real estate value collapse, because it doesn't take very long, if there are more houses than there are people, for the value of real estate to fall to what? To nothing? mean, that's what happened in Detroit. It basically fell to nothing. I mean, Detroit has recovered to some degree, but we don't know at all what the world would look like if real estate values fell to virtually nothing, especially because that's where most people put their retirement value. So what do you foresee happening on the political and economic front, given the shift towards the elderly demographically? We're going to see it in China first, right? Clearly.
Well, Japan too.
Japan too, yeah.
One of the reasons I moved to live in Japan is to be close to, I wanted to feel this problem. I wanted to be able to see it and almost touch it, and you can there. But you mentioned Detroit. I spent many, many years living in the suburbs of Detroit. And right around the time I was looking at the start of this project, that I was able to drive around the streets of Detroit and see street after street after street of tens and tens of thousands of decaying houses.
Yeah.
I remember one day driving along and there was a house, and these were nice houses back in the day, still spacious. And there was a young family having a picnic outside one of these houses. And it was the perfect setting, you might say, in every context, except every other house in the street looked like they were completely vacant, dilapidated. Around that time, listening to local Detroit news every night, it was crime, it was streetlights that weren't functioning, it was lack of safety, it was lack of functioning of basic utilities, it was infrastructure and bridges that the city couldn't afford. And of course, in 2013, it went bankrupt. So I had this backdrop to knowing what was happening to Detroit as a city. And you're right about property value. Around that time, you could buy a significant property in Detroit for $10,000.
Yeah.
You probably couldn't go there to ever see it because it wasn't safe at that time.
Right.
And you were right, Detroit has come back. So in some ways, it is a template.
Well, they demolished huge tracts of houses.
But how do you do that when half the houses are still occupied? You go through this period of time, unless you're going to say to people, everybody move 3 streets over now, and you do that every few years, you can't easily go into neighborhoods and start moving things back to nature, which is what Detroit's doing. You can individual houses, but you still have these scars of the empty spaces that were there. And I show some of this in the documentary. So the idea, people, I was on a podcast, Chris Williamson's recently, and it was the first time I got a sense of the comments that people make, and many people were sharing these deep personal stories about their life to do with unplanned childlessness. Others were sharing concerns about whether they'd ever become grandparents. So, but a lot of people were saying, well, this is just about economics. Who cares? This is just about big corporations suffering. Who cares? I think people need to understand this is going to impact everybody, everybody's life. If you're living in an area where there's literally decay, dilapidation all around you, and the taxes that you're paying to your city or your municipality aren't covering the basic infrastructure, no one's going to escape from this. And I think people don't understand that. So in my case, understanding life in Detroit, and again, I really love the city and it's great. I love the people. I love the way it is starting to come back. But that experience, I think, really spoke to me that we really need to think about what this means. Now, you talk about the socioeconomic. The economics, go beyond the city and the property values. It's the pension funds, it's the social welfare funds that people think. I think I did too at the time, that the retirement, the cost to maintain each of us in a retirement is basically what the government or someone's been saving for when we get to that age. It's not. What we're paying now.
That's a bargain with the future.
That's a bargain. You're covering the people who are retired now.
What the government has put away for us is debt. There's no savings.
And then
there's a promise.
Right. And then the debt's a problem because...
Yes, that's for sure.
If you have a shrinking number of taxpayers, the debt's not shrinking. So the repayment on the debt actually becomes worse and worse and worse.
Well, and hypothetically, you can remediate that with immigration, but then that opens up another can of worms, which is no one really knows what the maximal rate of incorporation a society can manage without imploding. Right? Obviously, Canada, the US in particular, is an immigrant society, and that's worked out extremely well for the immigrants and for the society. But the idea that there's no upper limit to our capacity to digest and integrate, let's say, is absolutely preposterous. So, and we don't know, but the notion that we can replenish at the rate that we're losing on the birth rate front strikes me as, it's at least a debatable claim.